Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Hyperlegible, a not boring radio production. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Reggie James, Hip City Reg on Twitter and the author of the Product Loss Substack. If you know Reggie, you might already be as excited for this conversation as I was coming into it. And if you don't, you're in for a treat. In this one, we discuss God, tech, spiritual technology, and much, much more. We could have gone on for hours, and the next time Reggie writes something, we'll probably do the conversation over again, because every time Reggie writes, I learn something new, and he's writing something that's totally different from what anybody else in tech is writing as far as I'm concerned. I have a little cold, so let's get right to it after a quick word from our sponsor, Readwise. Hyperlegible is sponsored by my friends at Readwise, who build software that helps you get the most out of your reading. I've been using Readwise for years to support my newsletter, my personal curiosity, and now this podcast. If you like listening to podcasts like Hyperlegible, if you're the kind of curious nerd who will read an essay and then listen to a podcast conversation about that essay, well, then I have something for you. You're going to love their Readwise Reader app. It's like Pocket, but next generation and better, with best-in-class highlighting, annotating, built-in AI, and more. It also supports not only web articles, but YouTube with highlightable transcripts, newsletters, PDFs, EPUBs, and even X threads. If you want to give it a try, you can go to readwise.io/hyperlegible. That's readwise.io/hyperlegible, where you can start a free trial and get all the articles discussed on Hyperlegible automatically added to your account. You'll find articles from Tina He, Atsab Memoria, Julian Lair, Alex Stanko, Parakeet, Conrad Bastable, Brian Potter, Mike Solana, and now you'll find A Tale of Two Vaticans by Reggie James. Reggie, I have been looking for an excuse to talk to you about something that you wrote, and I've been looking for an excuse to talk about what's going on in, religion, spirituality, in tech, outside of tech, and then you go ahead and write A Tale of Two Vaticans or OpenAI Building an Unholy Spirit. Thank you for doing that, because now I get to kill two birds with one stone. Can you summarize the piece in like 2 minutes?
Luckily, it came to me in the shower. It was one of those where all these stuff just sort of came together. And I think at a really high level preamble, Silicon Valley had this sort of maternalistic vision of replacing all of these functions that would typically be through the nurture of a mother or a parent. And I think, Uber is the best example of this. And I think Uber also represents 2010 Silicon Valley in the perfect way. Consumer, sort of this double-sided marketplace, gig economy. Travis as a character going up against governments, which is now a really big theme of technology. And so as we sort of graduated into the 2020s, I think there was a little bit of a wrestle of what was going to be the theme. I think crypto thought they had the mantle for a bit. I think Sam very clearly comes out with the mantle. And it's this question of, what does super intelligent AI look like? In a recent talk at Sequoia, he talked about wanting OpenAI to be this sort of subscription for your life. And when I heard that, that's when it all really clicked. I was like, okay, I used to joke that OpenAI was Sam's quest for a God that responded. And then when he said subscription for your life, knowing it wasn't just some super app WeChat thing, it became very clear oh, this is a theistic vision. And so the piece then goes from that preamble to the recognition of the theistic vision into what are the consequences of this, and the consequence and what the fight is over at the timing of an American Pope, to me, is a question of authority. And so the rest of the piece sort of goes into what is this sort of battle over authority, and what does that mean for the technology as well as our relationship to it, and then what does it mean for the person that might be questioning faith, which a lot of the Valley seems to be going through. And we could talk about that too.
I come into these with a list of questions that I want to get to, and then two more just already jumped to me. First one is just on your writing process. Do your pieces often come to you in the shower, or how do you normally write these pieces? Because they do feel things that you've thought about for a while, but then become fairly stream of consciousness. So how do you do it all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for me, I text myself a lot of sort of one-liners, two-liners. And I would say thoughts build up over time. I capture them disparately. And then very, very often it's an all at once thing. Like I really believe in letting your subconscious do as much work as possible. And so I'll be in the shower and it'll come to me full form. And sometimes I'm able to like grab my phone. Sometimes I just yell at my wife to come into the bathroom. And I kid you not, like she will just run into the bathroom. I will dictate, this is like boom, just rapid fire. She will write it all down for me and I'll come out of the shower. And then she kind of just understands I'm going to sit at the laptop and write for the next like 4 hours straight. And then I rip it straight. Like I say at the end of all my newsletters, I really don't do edits. It's very, very rare for me to like come back to a piece. So I rip it straight and then I just hit send. I can't actually sit too long with something or else I think I'll overdo it.
Another thing that you said in that answer, which is that it's Sam's kind of theistic vision. How often do you think it's like intentionally theistic versus like accidentally theistic?
That's a really great question.
Thank you.
The gracious part of me wants to say that it's accidentally theistic. I think that he probably actually doesn't think too deeply about it. And he's probably animated by other forces. But I think that the parallels are just so clear. I don't think that like Travis set out to be a very maternalistic.
It doesn't seem maternalistic. Yeah.
He's not a maternalistic guy, but I think the underlying themes of this, my broader like kind of theory of like replacement, to me it feels very clear. I also think, just to approach this slightly more humbly, I never really assume people's goals. However, I do feel very comfortable applying how I see the world on top of these companies, because I think you can sort of create interesting pockets and groups of what's really going on. Something I think is shocking about Silicon Valley in general is like they don't really read and they're not very into like criticism. It's very much a try it, didn't work, like try a new thing, and the learnings are sort of more held in the body than they are on paper, which I think is why I encourage like friends in New York to like go to SF as much as possible, because I think the Valley is one of the few places that like really leak out. The app, like the cats at Apple don't really leak out of the Valley, and if they do, they're actually very quiet. Maybe they'll go to LA, but you don't really run into like really cool Apple heads in New York. And so, I don't think it's intentional, and I also don't think it's very written down. I do think it is clear and apparent, and the danger is clear and apparent, which I think is why I sort of don't mind applying my frameworks to these things publicly.
Yeah, I'm reading Lewis Mumford's Technics and Civilization right now, and I am maybe 20 pages in, so I'm not going to be able to summarize the argument well. But one of the things that I picked up so far is that like a lot of technology, like going back to like the 15th century, is just a result of the culture that you're swimming in, and like the clock came from monks needing to understand kind of when to pray and all of those types of things. So it does that both of those points, that one, it's probably not intentional. Two, there's just like kind of something in the air. Both kind of seem to apply there.
Super.
Yeah. For you, what is the relationship between faith and work?
So there's like the personal, and then there's the, me working through like the theological frameworks, which is how I've been spending a lot of my time sort of post-eternal. I think from a theological framework, like right in the beginning of Genesis, God gives Adam and Eve work, right? There's science, right? He tasked them to catalog the animals. And then there's sort of like manual care, right? Taking care of the garden itself. So that from the get shows that God, even in perfect society, God values work. God values the process of work, and God values science. God values us interacting with nature, with animals, and the manual side of that, which is like the care of these things, right? So I think that the relationship between faith and work, even in a perfect, all the things taken care of society, is apparent. I think my current relationship with faith and work, and the thing that I'm kind of defining for myself now, is I would generally say this relationship with improving quality of life. something I was really struck by in reading Stuart Brand's The Media Lab is that the MIT Media Lab was founded on a question of how do we improve digital quality of life. So Nicholas Negroponte, one of the founders and the first director of the Media Lab, had this phrase, digital quality of life, where he saw, like our life is going to get increasingly digitized, and we're going to have these questions of like, what is a good digital life and what is a bad digital life, right? I think bad digital life is like loosey-goosey privacy and, nonstop notifications and all these things, right? And I think good quality of life is like a sense of autonomy, a sense of maybe digital money for some people, or like access to stable coins. These are all like quality of life questions. And so I think faith and work is about, to use like Trey's phrase, like taking on good quests. And to take on good quests means to improve quality of life for as many people as possible. In that process, good will not only like happen to you, like in your spirit, right? I think if you spend all day enabling gambling, that's probably not doing good things in your spirit, versus if you're like doing industrial farming or something like that. So not only what it does for you as a person, but naturally, what it does for those around you, for environment at scale, the fact that more and more people can contribute to positive quests. I think that's like probably at the core of faith and work for me right now.
I've been thinking about this a bunch as well. I mean, I grew up Catholic, went to church every Sunday, went to Catholic school, dropped out. I think, thought I was smart, all of that, but also like little things like, my Catholic school teachers telling the girl in our class whose parents were divorced that her mom was going to hell and stuff like that. I was like, I don't know, like this doesn't seem great. But I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I mean, like obviously there's something that we'll talk about, which is just like the, kind of renaissance of religion generally. But one of the things I've been thinking about, and it seems like it's a different way than you think about it, is that kind of tech provides the means. So like today we're recording this on a day the day after CHOP in Philadelphia, you went to Penn, announced that they saved a kid's life with a personalized gene editing therapy, which is like absolutely unbelievable. We'll probably cure cancer in the next decade or two. We're going to be able to travel anywhere in the world and maybe out of space super fast. And all of that to me is like the means that it like enables positive experiences. And then there's the meaning side, which I think is like the religion shaped whole of all of this. And so I view one as like setting the conditions for the experiences, and the other as like kind of providing, the sense of meaning. It sounds like to you, they're a little bit more interwoven. And even when you say it, I agree. Like you want to be working on things that have a purpose, not just enabling the potential for meaning.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think, like not to be this kind of design guy, but I think like something that really stood out to me when I was in Japan was like just how serious they took every level of like service, right? And I think that as technologists of like some privilege and education, it's very easy to dismiss your everyday barista or something like that. But I think in Japan, what you see with that service is how much better you feel as the individual receiving that. And I think that going back to faith and work, when you take in that the interaction as a barista that I'm about to provide this person might be their first positive interaction of the day, right? If it's the morning before they go to work, and that I can help set this person's mood maybe before they have a day that they're not looking forward to, that's a little bit lighter. I think you can see the elements of faith and work even in something that small, right? And this is also why I think people are very frustrated, just like colloquially, with like things like people playing music on their phone on a bus, right? Because it's a complete antisocial disregard for your like fellow commuter. And that, although not tied to work, is a sort of like heart posture towards like the folks around you, And so to me, it's really about this high level of care that is applied to each interaction and each person around me. And those things are both complementary and not necessarily tied to like, quote, the most impactful work, but it's the impact that I recognize this other person is a complex person with a complex interior that might be going into a day that's not great, and I can actually serve a higher purpose, which is giving this person joy, giving this person care through this cup of coffee. I think those things are deeply underrated, particularly in American society, that I hope faith and work can actually pull out in a higher sense.
I'm going to ask you like the impossible question, which is like, how? How do we get there?
I don't want to get into a whole thing about like what I think is wrong with the American church. And I also think like, beyond religious revival, I think cultures generally stack values in very interesting ways, right? If you go to Italy, right, there's a very particular set of values Italians have. If you go to France, there's a particular set of values the French have. For example, not working in August, like all these things build up a culture, right? Or even like speaking French when you're in Paris, like when you speak English, even if they know English, they're like, get that the hell out of here.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes like, okay, what is the American value set today? And how can that get inverted, or how do we introduce a new one, and through what means? I think a value such as care is such a fundamental one that's been eroding in American society. And I think that's also because we don't have a shared narrative of where we're going. I wrote about this 2.5 years ago, creative directing the United States.
Yep.
And without a shared sense of direction, it's very hard to align any set of values. And so the highest value in America is simply the self and self-gratification, which justifies any set of values I take on to realize some sense of self. And once you have a culture deeply tied to individualism, even something as simple as like, hey, we need to wear masks because it's scientifically proven to like help stop spread or whatever it is, that becomes an impossible battle in a culture that values the individual as high as it does. The positives is that you get a lot of young men going west to build generational companies, right? Because it's about an individual sense of realization of one's potential. The negative is that I will listen to my phone on speaker on the train and I don't care who it bothers because I need to do this, So it all cuts both ways. Even the Japanese example, like that's not like a high risk taking culture that's impacted Japan in interesting ways. So yeah, I don't know the how, I know the what. But I think like anything else, like one really great ad campaign can help seed the idea. But I think it's really hard to unwound individualism. So it's almost better if we show these things through an economic imperative, like creating a cafe, like the next Starbucks that like acts very Japanese and high level of care, and then that succeeds economically, and then you can say the propaganda machine of like, yeah, the reason why this succeeds economically is because we value care, and then people are like, oh, like now my company has to do that, and then like there can be like mimetic sort of ripple effects.
I don't think you answered this in the creative director piece, but if this is our goal, who would you have creative direct the US?
I think Ralph Lauren has acted as like a creative director for the United States for quite a while. Olympic uniforms, the US Open. I think there's like a rugged Americana, but also still quite polished. I think the problem is like, I don't think Ralph really cares about any sort of like technical sense of the United States. So you kind of need someone that can both aesthetically present a unifying vision. And again, Ralph is interesting because like, you have like the appeal to both the highest echelons of American society and, the lowest at the same time. It's something really special there. But yeah, he doesn't really care about technology in any way that I've seen. I mean, I would love the job. I think I could do a pretty good
I'll give you the
job. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really hard question because I think like it's so it needs an aesthetic. I think Donald Trump is actually far more of a creative director than he is like a president in so many ways. I think even like bringing Elon around was the act of a creative director and not a president. It was really to show a symbolism of who he thought was the most important person to have by his side that wasn't even the vice president. I think there's something to be said about that. And as the counterexample, like Kamala, had like rappers and like just like artists, and they like I mean I wrote this whole thing like the president can't be Brat, and I think like it was actually it was a tale of like creative direction more than anything else. I think before Kanye went crazy, I would have said Kanye.
I
Like
mean,
Wyoming era.
What if we had put him in that role and now
I
he
know.
creative directed us into World War III?
I know. Thank God we didn't.
I guess into this stew and into this value stack now comes, at least on the surface, this resurgence of religion. Like Bible sales were up 22% last year. Influencers, like the New York Times did a piece, are like all kind of starting to wear crosses, whether they believe it or not. The Gundo, as you write in the piece, is like kind of vocally Christian. Why do you think there is this religious renaissance going on, both in America and in tech specifically?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in like a crisis of meaning, and I think that's only going to get worse as like our anxiety around work and particularly AI sort of help us to reach a legitimate labor crisis. Like we started off about like, God values work and gave us work even in a perfect society. I think if you're already anxious about your future state of like personal independence and your ability to provide for yourself and a better future for you and whatever you view as your future, whether that's like a family or not, I think when that gets put into existential crisis and the leaders of the industry are helping to propel it, like a lot of AI people talk about like, oh, well, we're going to have like massive labor. And they say it so flippantly. Like, I think you are forced to ask yourself like, okay, what is the larger question of like, what is happening right now? And so then you get into like kind of three scenarios. I need to find a philosophy that answers these things. I need religion to help me answer these things. Or you need to have like the Timothy Leary sort of like inner trip vibe, like drop out, tune in. But I think everyone's sort of aware that like secularism brought them to this place. And if secularism brought me to this meaning crisis, even if it's like unconscious that that's what it is, I need to like zag the complete other way. And so, you get a funny mix of things happening all at once, right? You get Conclave, the movie. You get like Francis dying, which brings up a lot of religious media. You got an American Pope, which brings up a lot of new questions for American faith. And then you're like, let me just walk into, a Catholic church. And then you see how beautiful it is. And in that moment of crisis, you're just like, this has a lot of appeal right now. And I think, a few key people did like make it chic over like a period of time. Like Justin Bieber was going to like that church in LA, again, like pre like really off the rocker, yay, and like Wyoming and God is King album or Jesus is King. And yeah, I think I've written about this a lot, but I think millennials sort of lived in this sort of like detached irony. I think Virgil represented this to the extreme extent in terms of like pop culture. But I think being resigned to detached irony of like your environment can only last you so long. Eventually you're going to get hit by a truck and it won't be that detached anymore. And I think we've been hit with like a lot of historic trucks. We got hit with COVID. You got hit with, 2008. You got hit with like nonstop American interventionalism. You got, hit with like ballooning student loan debt. You got hit with like job crisis after job crisis. And now you're getting hit with like AI. And, eventually you have to just like say, God, please help me. And once you do that, then you're like kind of forced to like find that answer.
So interesting. Just listening to the answer, it feels like there's almost, and this is going to be like the wrong phrasing, but bear with me, like the defensive turn to faith, which is what you're talking about. And then to me, like kind of like the reanimation for me was, I mean, like this is, but like listening to telepathy tapes, I was like, oh shit, like there is, like doing that and then like piercing, like combining it with what I just read in like Desjardins, which I think like Desjardins might be my kind of Catholic hero. And the perennial philosophy and just like all these little things that like all point in the same direction. Like, I almost feel like the perennial philosophy, like that we're all kind of this like we're all part of this one thing, is almost like a protocol, and then religions are like kind of different interfaces or clients on top of that protocol. But like to me, there's almost like a more offensive, like in like the proactive version of it, where it's like, all right, if machines can do all of this, I know that humans are special. Like, what else can we do? What are we a part of? Like, where's the magic in the world? And I think like there's also, maybe this is a little defensive offensive, but like magic has been drained from the world. And now people are like, all right, like I want to like re-tap into those things that we've like clearly lost with, I think probably like the downfall of less wrong and rationalism, more generally. And like all of those types of things are like, clearly the answers aren't there, but like there might be some really cool stuff over here.
I think there's some truth to that. I I like the defensive, offensive. I think it's a little hard for me. I grew up in a Christian family. My dad, by trade, was a plumber, and my parents were both short-term missionaries, doing like infrastructure projects. Like my dad. My dad's like a hero of mine. He went to like sub-Saharan Africa several times. He brought the family there. We adopted my sister from there. He built irrigation systems on farms. He brought me, just like me and him, one trip, and we built like churches like in the bush. My mom also went to Bolivia and like worked in ministry for like women whose husbands were in prison, and all like it's like my family's just so mission driven. So I only know sort of like offensive Christianity, so to speak. It's like I only know Katrina happened. Like I saw my dad drive down south to help rebuild. I only know like offensive boots on the ground towards building. But I agree. I think a lot of my answers are actually pretty. It's looking at folks reaching out to Christianity from a defensive position. But I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I just think like that's what happens when you get beat down, and like your philosophies fail you, which, most people come to any belief when they're broken. It's very rarely you come to a sense of belief when you're like up top, actually, when you're up top, things tend to get really weird. Like Elon and like having like 16 kids from like 13 women, like you tend to actually like just stray further when there's no map for you. And I don't know, I don't want to be, I'm not like some arbiter of morality, but I do think like things tend to get weird when you have nothing stopping you.
What do you think a Christian Elon looks like?
What's so funny is I actually don't think it's that much different, other than him being a little bit humbler. Like I think he's still like doing Tesla. I think he's still doing SpaceX, Solar City. Boring. I just think like he's funny enough, he probably looks a little bit more like Zuck. It's like he has his kids with his wife, and it's stable. And you're just like, wow, I can't believe this guy who's doing all these things is also stable, and that becomes an inspiration. I think like that's the thing that keeps me on the Zuck is good crew is that so far his home life seems to be incredibly stable, and it's like a really good counterexample to basically all the other, tech guys. But yeah, I think he would just look more like that.
It seems like Elon's almost like uncomfortable in his nerdiness and like tries to like make jokes and stuff like that. And Zuck is like going on Theo Von, just being the biggest nerd ever.
Elon seems miserable in a very deep way. But I also think, unfortunately, it probably drives him to do the things that only he can do. And so
that was, in the Walter Isaacson book, it was so funny. Like I've said this before, but like the whole book, it seems like it's like, Elon had this fucked up childhood and like all these bad things happened. Like, I wonder if Elon would have been the same without all these terrible experiences. Like the answer is like very clearly no. And like, you don't want anybody to go through that, but it is probably good for the world that he had to go through all of that. And I don't know if there's anything religious in there, but like it is sure. Like, it is interesting for humanity that somebody had to suffer so we could go to space and get electric cars. And my God, there's religion. There's religion everywhere.
Seems like a theme.
Yeah. Well, all right. So I want to take us back to your essay and away from Elon. So we talked about Uber and being maternalistic and that being kind of emblematic of the 2010s. You talked about actually how SpaceX and Coinbase, while they were founded in the 2000s, are more representative of kind of 2020s tech. Did these things is this like a just action reaction synthesis type situation going on, or like? How do you think the kind of text eras relate to each other?
I personally believe that it's all like sort of like one-time historic. I don't really believe in like cycles. As I do love the book The Fourth Turning, I do think there are like super high level themes that are sort of like cyclical, but I think it has a direction. I think that, for example, I think Coinbase, had to start in the 2010s, even go, public or what have you, early 2020s. But it's so clearly a 2020s company, because so much other things had to happen for it to even be interesting today, beyond just like you buy Bitcoin here and we make fees, And I think like without sort of the SaaSification of the Valley in the 2010s, the growth of the capital class, the growth of the engineering class. I mean, if you look at the amount of venture firms in like 2005, let's say, versus 2015, it's like it's actual insanity,
Yeah.
And so these things need to happen for these future themes to even take place. You have to have the SpaceX so that the Vardas can exist, because they act as sort of these inflows for a type of a type of person that can even outflow into the theme of whatever that decade might be. So yeah, I don't view it as cyclical. I definitely view it as one-time historic. I think it's going somewhere. I think some decades are more fun than others. I think we're in a very, dare I say, fun decade, despite how chaotic it can feel.
I think we're in a fun decade too. And I am a believer in the same thing that you are, I think, on this, which is like, I'm an everything happens for a reason person on all of this stuff. And like, without all of that SaaS, you don't get all of the stuff that we're doing right now. Like even the hardware stuff is all software enabled. And that never would have happened without us spending 50 years in the whole history of humanity building software after building hardware forever. So like you need that period. And now we have all of it, is kind of my general thesis.
100%. I mean, what's funny about, these AI models is like they're insanely hardware enabled, but you wouldn't get that if we didn't scale up AWS and like all these other cloud providers over the past 10 plus years. And so even getting to be like, oh yeah, we're gonna like train this like $1 billion model on like all of these.
Well, I mean, there's like the theory that the ASI created Bitcoin because it needed something to keep GPUs going between video games and AI. And so it went back and created Bitcoins that people would farm and buy enough GPUs that eventually we could build the digital god. Like it is amazing.
In that?
I don't believe in that, but I do think like just like in the whole history of technology, it is amazing how often things like this happen. And obviously humans go back and like fill in the blanks and paint stories and all of that. But it is amazing that like a graphics chip ended up also being good for Bitcoin and original Ethereum. And then like just at the time where that demand started falling off, it's like, oh, what do we do with all these GPUs? Oh, we can actually like, it turns out you just need a ton of GPUs to train models. It's just like an unbelievable historical accident.
Yeah. Have you read What Technology Wants by
Yeah.
Kevin Kelly? To me, this is like such a clear what technology wants thing, which is like to say like, I do view technology as an almost like biological entity. I do think it has like a sense of desire that is related to us. And this goes back to like, I think folks in Silicon Valley like don't read, like they create a sort of like their lack of faith actually makes them make leaps of ginormous faith. Like Bitcoin is an ASI that's reaching back from the future. Like that statement is so wild in how written in faith it is, and it's a faith of also like sort of like pumping your own bag, which is also funny. When in fact, like if you read like Kevin Kelly's like What Technology Wants, you can just see like how these things happen again and again over time. It's like there's no like Bitcoin's not an ASI, dog. Like technology has a desire to be revealing to us so that we continue to tinker with it. And like you can just look at the historic demand of capital to company formation to the growth of like these services, and it's just like,
well, I mean, it is funny now that you say that. Like I don't know if you've read Boom by Bert Hobart and Tobias.
I haven't
It's good. I mean,
Thank you,
I think
Tammy. Thank you, Tammy at Stripe Press.
yeah, I think you'd be familiar with a lot of the ideas in there, but like very much, bubbles are these kind of like faith things that actually pull the future forward, pull all the resources towards the thing that like seems absolutely impossible, but like a small group of weirdos believes that it's possible. Bitcoin is one of the examples that they use, and so like maybe that's a little bit of the mechanic behind technology getting what it wants. But you need that like kind of big, exciting, almost like kind of eternal, no pun intended, vision for what the thing can become to like throw the normal numbers and analysis out the window.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what sort of like gathers the people, to like get their hands on the metal, and that is what enables all these sort of. I think about this with I'm sure you've seen like the General Magic documentary. That's such a great example. It's like all of these incredible people, old Apple, future Apple, building what is a directionally correct first smartphone, and complete flop, but it gets all these people primed for the idea of mobile and personal computers in our pockets and all these things. And then those same people help build the iPod, they help build the iPhone, they build Nest, they build all these things that we deeply love and respect. And it came from like a faith bubble, and that's part of the physics of, I don't want to say the world. I think it's just part of the unique physics of Silicon Valley. And that's why it's, so cherished and so special.
Yeah, there's almost these two ways that it happens, because like there's one where General Magic pulls something forward and like kind of kicks off, decades of development, and that's led to, I guess they started with like PDAs after General Magic, and then the phone now. And then there's the other thing that happens in tech, which is like half of the ideas being built in the Gundo and just like in hard tech in general right now came out of 1950s and 1960s like Russian physics papers, and they just like they don't get that initial excitement. They're hidden, and then people like kind of rediscover them now and build them. A lot of the ideas are old, but maybe there's just like two different evolutionary paths of either you like pull the underlying components that you need forward, or you just kind of like wait until those components are ready.
100%. Yeah, I talked about this in a recent talk where I talked about, the ideas that started at the MIT Media Lab. Alan Kay had this project called Vivarium that was like giving AI to Looney Tunes characters for never-ending stories in the 80s, and Amazing. It's just like, you can look at that as character AI, you can look at that as like the future things that's happening with the new GTA. There's so many ways that you can look at, that. And yeah, there's so many ideas, particularly I think from the 80s, that are just lying dormant, that the tech is finally there for, and you can pull forward into like incredible products and companies. I don't think that's cyclical, but I do think there is something to being a student of history and references and being able to pull those things forward and being like appropriately in the lineage of them.
Yeah, I've written about the fact that the ideas always show up in sci-fi before, and tried to use early Claude to run some analysis. And I think part of it is simply too that like the ideas are much easier to create than the products that come out of those ideas. Like you could be living in the second century and come up with an idea for something, maybe not second century, but like hundreds of years ago, come up with the idea for something that it takes centuries for the components to come about and actually build it. And so probably most of the cool things that get built over the next 50 years, the idea is already out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think like Leonardo da Vinci, like designed the idea for like a tank, well before that was possible, All
right. I'm going to pull us back to your piece again. This is too fun. I think we could probably do this for like 7 hours, but so replacing is a central theme. We went from replacing mom now to replacing God. What's like the difference in those two replacements now?
I think, the central theme next to replacement is this like idea of authority. And so I think like we're moving up on like the authority ladder or the authority scale. Again, going like sort of way, way back, like the first authority level that I think technologists attack is sort of like, and continue to attack, is nature or like environment, right? So like we farm the land to produce sustenance at such a degree that we have like omakase every other block on Manhattan, like that's a pretty high level of authority over nature. And there's like still ways to go. Like something I think about a lot is the growth of solar and like the gains that we're getting there. To me, that's sort of like the really great example that authority can be incredibly generative. And like the worst part of solar seems to be like a very simplistic view of like aesthetics, but I think, I think solar farms are more beautiful than oil rigs in the ocean, so that's whatever. So then the question becomes like, okay, like there's environment, and then I think, this maternalistic view is like family structure. So that feels pretty like appropriate on the ladder, right? It's like land, and then you look around, see each other. But I think to some degree we all understand like our parents are like fallible. So the idea of like replacing their nurture while they have interesting consequences, I think isn't too crazy. One example of a consequence I like to think about with Uber Eats, and Drew Austin talks about this a lot, is like the invisible cost on like the public space from food delivery. And I mean, you're a New Yorker, so it's like you look outside of any Shake Shack, and it's like 90% food delivery bikes blocking the entire sidewalk, which is a public cost, made by someone on the seventh floor of their apartment, not thinking about how that's changing literal city infrastructure. And so, our parents are fallible, which means these companies are fallible, and we can critique them and adjust and sort of shape this care. But the really interesting thing, I think, is that we all graduate to some extent from our parents' care, right? And I actually think this idea of churn is actually like a graduation from like the care that these sort of companies provide. So now when we move up one more level on this scale of authority, where we're replacing God, I think, the biggest thing is that there's just a lot more at stake. And, I would rather in a way sort of like get folks working more like on crypto and rethink like financial system and governance and like provable identity. There's like, that's like a little bit more comfortable. The stakes are higher than like, a sense of maternal nurture, but nothing's going to get too wonky. But I think like for us to build God means that we put the entirety of ourselves in God. And if we know we're fallible, that means that at a very high level, the authority that we're putting over ourselves and these systems are extended flaws, which is interesting. And I don't think we fully worked through these frameworks all the way. I think that's the thing, like Sam gave an interview where he said like, we're going to need a new like social contract. And then the interviewer said, okay, well, what is that? And he's just like, I don't know. I just know we need a new one. And I am extremely, like not a Luddite. I'm pretty decently accelerationist, but I think something that tech people struggle with is like a genuine sense of critique that is birthed out of wanting to do things right as the stakes get higher. And instead, I think we've gotten very comfortable with like bad analogies, right? I think like one analogy that we have probably with AI is actually borrowed from Elon, which is to say like, no, as long as like the rocket gets up to space and we get the satellite up, it covers the cost of it exploding back on Earth. That's true, but if we don't apply first principles to like, well, what happens when AI goes wrong and we get like sycophantic AI that just indulges in our delusion while it also like meddles over here, I think that's like deeply problematic if we're giving it the entirety of ourselves. So I think as we move up on the like authority chain, we also need to move up on our ability to be critical. Yeah, this is sort of like the personal omniscience thing,
Yeah, let's dive in. I love that phrase, personalization of omniscience, because God, AI as God is often used as like kind of one of those analogies too. And I think that can be like to make it seem scarier than it actually is, or more powerful, depending on whose kind of incentives are at play. It seems like you've used it in a pretty thoughtful way here. So what is the personalization of omniscience? Like, how is AI like God?
Yeah, this was like from my Hereticon talk. I think in a lot of ways, when we're building technology, we're trying to like reach these sort of like supernatural properties. And one property of God in the Christian Bible sense, which is kind of what I focus on, is this idea of omniscience, right? So if omniscience is the knowing of everything, my phrase like personal omniscience is knowing everything about me, right? And this is again really straightforward, detailed in the Bible. There's a verse in Luke 12 that's like, even the hairs on your head are all numbered, right? Which is to say like, I know everything about you. which is a great comfort. So when we think about AI, like one of the big updates this year was perfect memory. And, with the types of prompts going viral, it's all of these prompts that are like, given everything you know about me, very key phrase, given everything you know about me, how should I think about this? Or what are some flaws I don't see about myself? And so it's clear that this goal of like perfect memory and personalization is going to be so high. Like, how could we ever turn off the subscription? Right? You're losing like the most intimate and even though corporate, like intimate and like private relationship that exists in your life, as long as you give it enough. And previously that was only a property of God, like this sense of like personal direction, this sense of like, I am wrestling with this private sin, right? This is like what confessional is. And so it's like people are going to ChatGPT for confessional. It's giving it like, instead of saying 3 Hail Marys, it's like, I'm so glad you asked. Here's a list of 3 things you can do to
Totally.
to XYZ. And that's very new.
Although, even just hearing you say that, there is a clear difference between actual omniscience and whatever ChatGPT has now. Because it like anchors, until it has full omniscience, it anchors on whatever you've kind of talked about it with most recently. And so like, you'll ask about yourself and it'll be like, you love writing essays on like whatever the most recent thing I wrote an essay on was. It's that, you're really kind of like pulling me down into like one dimension here. And so it's not great at it yet, but certainly like the food, I have this cold right now. Like the things I put in my body today are as a result of what I asked ChatGPT I should put in my body today. So like, certainly I'm treating it like that, but I don't think it has perfect knowledge. And so like, there is a little bit of a worry that I have that
for sure
it's like not giving me great advice because it doesn't have actual kind of full knowledge.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting when the voice model gets good enough. And if you use it enough, it'll be like, oh, do you have a cold? Like all these, like a bit like that. Cause that's just like a very direct thing of like, oh, you don't sound the same. Let me see if I can confirm this. Yeah, I agree. It's obviously not perfect right now. I think the goal is for it to get as close as possible. And I mean, this sort of gets into like a simulation and like simulacra thing, like I think maybe the white pill, which I don't know if it's cope, but it's just like, it can ever only be a simulation of what I know to be God. That's kind of why I'm comfortable and why I wouldn't stop any like AI advancement. But I do think for the less media literate, and I mean media literate in like a McLuhan-esque way, like I think it can be very easy to get sucked in and tricked and I don't want to say held hostage because that assumes like very bad intent. But like I think it's very easy to get sucked in the same way people get sucked into like 5-hour like doom scrolling on TikTok. It's a attack on the psyche in a core way.
Now we have this like kind of countervailing force in the war between the two Vaticans, or is it a war? I guess is the first question. But we have Pope Leo. What's the significance of Leo's name?
So Leo the 13th, we're on the 14th. Leo the 13th served from 70. I wrote this down so I didn't misquote it. From 1878 to 1903, and very focused on social justice. This was like industrial revolution. So workers' rights was like very important, spoke out a lot about this. And Leo the 14th, American Pope, USA, has already talked about like the rapid pace of AI and viewing himself in a similar position as it relates to the ethical and societal challenges of workers' rights and coming displacement, as well as like broader human dignity and like the church's responsibility to that. So it's interesting because, he's pretty young, which to me is also like a really big signal of like the church seeking stability. And this is also the thing that the church has over any sort of like worldly leader, right? Other than, I mean, it's funny because the opposite case is like Putin and Xi Jinping, like they don't have like traditional term limits, but free Western world, what have you. This is a big difference he has, which is that he'll be in his position for quite a while, similar to a CEO, where as long as there's performance, they're there. And Pope Leo even avoids the sort of performance piece. And so that stability is really interesting. I also think this ties into like why people are attracted to faith right now, right? Is like this search of stability during uncertain times. and being like, oh, well, the Pope is going to be there for quite a while, and they elect leaders in like 2 days, and it's not like this big like divisive campaign that we see, at least. And I think that becomes very attractive in comparison to whatever the 2028 election will bring, or the instability that we see in multiple global conflicts.
I hadn't thought about the kind of like long tenure and like stable tenure that the Pope is able to have, because it's probably because I haven't been paying enough attention, but it doesn't feel like they have like a project, right? Like if you look at like an MBS who will be running the kingdom for however many decades, they have very explicitly like Vision 2030. And I talked about this with Solano when he was on before. Like there's some amount of dictatorship that is actually useful in getting a long-term project done. There are all sorts of downsides, but if you want something that's going to last, like you can't build anything in 4 years. If you want something that's actually going to get done over time, having that kind of long view is super important. What do you think the project of Pope Leo will be that he can like kind of chip away at for the next couple of decades?
I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is actually going to be setting the groundwork for how the church wants to think about these upcoming technologies. So they already released a pretty substantial document on their views of AI, which is really interesting if you haven't gotten the chance to read that. It's quite long, but good. And so I think they're already setting the groundwork of like, this is how the church is thinking about these present technologies. And then I think they're going to, with that framework, with that, foundation, they'll be able to be a little bit more reactive in a way to help people think through it as well. Then I think it really becomes a question of what actually ends up happening, right? We are operating on such high levels of projection today, that like maybe you can say that the Microsoft layoff, maybe there's some like AI efficiency gains that they're seeing that they're not like publicizing. I don't think so. But maybe. And so, I think his job is going to be a little bit more reactionary to what's happening. Unless they, start their own model internally, which, the Vatican Bank has plenty of money to do that. I would love to see like a data farm at the Vatican. I think that would be really sick.
That would be incredible, but I think it goes the opposite. Like, I don't think you want like the Christian AI. I think you want.
Oh, I disagree.
Well, maybe you do. I think if you're the Catholic Church, I think you want to be like, cool. Is that making you feel happier? Like,
right. Like,
there's the pinnacle of your like technological pursuits.
Yeah,
we're still here. Yeah.
No, that's true. I think to be a true counterforce, it's not about just building like a competitive thing. It's actually just having a totally different force as the competition vector, which would be the smarter thing. I do think there is room, obviously, for like spiritual technology and being like very direct about that. It's something that this group that we've like formed, it's my friend Dowda Leonard and Elon Rutberg, spiritual technology group. Like, we talk about this like a lot. And right now, a lot of like, spiritual technology is kind of old. It's like the rosary is a good example of like spiritual technology. But I think there's a lot of room for new spiritual technology. But I don't think that's necessarily the church's direct job. I think they have enough on their plate.
And then another tangent that you're bringing me on, and I'm going to blank. I'll throw it up in the show notes or on the screen afterwards on both the author and the name of the book. But the meditation teacher who wrote, I'm going to blank on all of this, but who essentially wrote like, there's a next Buddha predicted at some point, and he thinks that it's going to be like a group of people using technology to help people achieve enlightenment. What do you think the spiritual technology that we need is?
I think this could be my next company. I would how much to say? I would broadly say, this comes back to my point on like folks that want to reach God, lowercase g, as technology versus like God, uppercase G, through technology. So looking at the rosary, like the rosary is a sort of tool that guides you through experience, that you move around as you pray and commune with God, right? And I'm not Catholic, I'm Presbyterian, so I don't pray the rosary. But my grandmother prayed the rosary every morning, and it was next to her bedside. And I think that to me, it's really thinking about what are rituals that already exist in the church that we can help people formalize and make slightly less abstract. And so I think Hallow, I think is the name of the app, like does this really well. And they clearly have figured out a lot for Catholics through digital community, through prayer, through a lot of content that helps folks break down some of the complexities of the Bible. I think that's I would say that's like a mix of community and like education, maybe is how I would classify Hallow. And I think that's a really good example of like a digital spiritual technology. I'm more interested in hardware. I think Quakers are also really interesting in this way. Like Quaker meeting houses are all sort of like constructed similarly. And I think you can actually view a lot of James Turrell, the artist who is a Quaker. You can actually view his work as an extension of Quaker spiritual technology through light and silence and meditation. The examples are around us for those with the eyes to see.
I had never thought of it like that. I didn't know he was Quaker, actually. As we're winding down here, there's just so many things that I could be asking you, but does this go up to and include kind of like a new church? Like I know like the church or like different churches try different approaches to like reach the youth and, try new things. Terrell seems like a beautiful way of doing it. And it's not maybe as on the nose. Whereas like, something with like electric guitar is like maybe you lose some of the beauty of kind of traditional Catholic church. Do you think it is like almost like the brand pace layers, like having just like the old thing there that like is steady and works is like always going to be the core, and like that's what people will come back to, and then you build different kind of spiritual technologies on top? Do you think the church itself needs to change? Giving you all the easy questions.
I'll start with like church itself and church experience. I love the pace layer example. I mean, as you know from like my Twitter, my header is the pace layer. So I love that. I think that going back to meaning and purpose beyond the now, I actually think it would be a mistake for the church to change too drastically for where we are. I think that while the word of God is living, it's also not changing. And that is part of the point, that these lessons are eternal, and these lessons actually do reflect all ages for those willing to sit with it, And again, I think the same way we're in a crisis for meaning, I do think like we might be in a crisis for beauty. And I don't think it's like a mistake that when people go to Europe, something that they do subconsciously is they just walk into cathedrals. They can be as agnostic and they will sit there and take that in. I don't think that's a mistake. I don't think that's like coincidence of just architecture. The Pompidou in Paris is really dope. I think more people walk into the random church next to it than probably inside of it, which I think is really interesting. So I would be wary of changing, because I think what you get are like institutions like Hillsong, which have so many issues, and I do not endorse. And that's what happens when you try to change too much with the times. And at this point, Hillsong just seems like millennial cringe, like weird woke church, and I don't think it's gonna last.
And I mean, the weird thing is like those are the ones who are actively like they're the startups that are doing customer acquisition essentially. So like that is a lot of people's like kind of, maybe until the Leo stuff recently, like their touch point with new Christianity. So I'm going to give you the chance, like, what do you think people get wrong or don't appreciate enough about Christianity coming in from the outside? And like, how should, and this is personal and all of that, but how should people who are now kind of like, going through the meaning crisis and like reconsidering their faith, like what tips would you have on kind of approaching it all?
I think what people get wrong and the approach are actually one and the same. And I think this is why I focus so much on authority. I think the American mindset of individualism really soaks the nature of like the soul, which is to say that I know best for my life. And that is a very specific heart posture of pride. And until you can like sort of lower yourself to really ask yourself, I have done everything my own way up until this point, and I am still miserable, or I am still feeling these gaping holes, or I'm still trying to fill these holes with drugs, sex, work, whatever it is, and it is not working. Why is this not working? And you realize at that point, I can continue on self-authority, or I can realize there is an authority that is higher than me. That is everything right there. Either you will give into an authority that is higher than you, or you will continue on self-authority. And I think that what people get wrong and what people struggle with when they're trying to rediscover this is that they do not want to submit to authority, because that is the leap of faith, right? The leap of faith is not just, oh, I think that there's something higher going on here. It's the literalness that because I believe this, I believe that that higher power has authority over me. And that's very hard. If you are full individualistic, maxed out.
I can see that. How does that actually like show up? Like when you give yourself up to a higher power, like in your day-to-day life, like what is the hard part for people of giving, like what decisions are they giving up, or like how does that show up?
I think there's like very obvious ones, like I think things like, oh, like I enjoy sports gambling and I'm now recognizing that that's wrong and I'm gonna have to like work through that. This kind of comes back to the piece of like, I think a lot of people view the list of things of like Christianity as like, oh, there's a set of rules and I can't break them. This rule breaking versus rule making paradigm that I lay out. And unfortunately, people get very hung up on like, oh, I can't break these rules and blah, blah, blah. And it has nothing to do with breaking rules. You're going to break rules because you are flawed and will sin. It's not about breaking rules. You will be forgiven and break them all throughout your whole life. It's whether or not you come to this position of, I cannot make the rules. It's so simple, but it's so hard, because what we all want to do is say, I like all of this, let's say 95%, except for this 5%. And if I could just change that 5%, but that 5% is the only 5% that matters. Now, for you, the individual, this is when Christianity gets personal. Because if you can agree to the 95%, then that's not the thing you need to work through. What you need to work through is, why are you so hung up on that 5%? And that's the part when people really fall out, because they don't want to give up that personal sense of authority of what they believe or how they act, right? And that gets personal for every person. That could be addiction to pornography. It could be not wanting to settle down, with the wife and kids or husband or whatever, because, you enjoy sort of like the Peter Pan lifestyle of being young and in New York. It could also be as simple as like struggling with like greed, and like I work all day and I don't want to give up any money to any sort of like cause, right? Because I want to enjoy this money the way I want to enjoy it. All of these things are laid out, in the Bible, and how to interact with all these things. And what's so interesting is like, people sort of view it as the Bible being out of date or what have you. It's like, it couldn't be more up to date, because these things that we struggle with that's the most human part about us. It's like, these things actually don't change. None of these things change. Nothing is new under the sun. And I think people, understandably so, the struggle has been the same since like the beginning, right? Which is this idea of rule making and setting the rules for oneself. And that's the most American thing that there is, which is funny.
Are the rules themselves a spiritual technology? And I will let you off the train, but like, are the rules themselves a technology where you say like, give to other people, and studies show that if you give,
yes,
you're happier.
100%, 100%. It is the, this is, as a side note, this is also why I'm obsessed with like Dune, because I think they understand like like the litany against fear, as a technology almost.
Yeah.
All of these things are spiritual technologies, right? There's a really interesting study about like people that choose to strike up a conversation on the train with someone next to them versus people that don't. Now, as a New Yorker, it sounds insane, right? But the study shows like it was something like 80% of people that chose to strike up a conversation with someone next to them were happier when they got off the train than the person that was isolated, like listening to music by themselves. You would never make that bet, as a New Yorker, but it's true. And what is it? And what does it say? Like, love thy neighbor. Well, what is loving thy neighbor? Showing them attention and care and simply just asking, hey, I'm Reggie. Like, how's your day? How are you doing? That is good for you. All of these things are good for you.
It's so funny.
Good for you.
There's across the hall from me is, an office. There's probably like, I'd say 5 Gen Z women who work in there. Today, like we've like nodded before. Today, somebody came from out of town and like literally had her suitcase and was standing outside the door. And I left my office. And she was like, "Hi, how are you?" And it's like, clearly you're not from New York, but it like made me feel good.
Oh yeah, no. Listen. There's a reason. Like when you go to Austin, and you're like standing at a bar and some nice, older woman is just like, "How you doing, darling?" It's just like there's nothing that feels better in that moment than that, darling. And these things are so simple and they're so hard at the same time. And that's what we're wrestling with. Yeah, I think that going back to sort of faith and work, I remember being at a party and like I was partying and I had this like real moment of realize, and it was like a bunch of tech people, and I had this real moment of realizing like I don't actually think these people care about people. And I started crying like at this party, and my friend's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, I'm just having this realization that I don't think these people care about other people. And I think this is like where a lot of the sort of desire for like good quest or like this interest in sort of like faith and work comes from. It's actually a recognition of like, have we been ignoring like a big part of this formula? Has the Valley been ignoring a big part of this formula? And I mean like Silicon Valley as like, the broader sort of
idea. Yeah.
The idea. And I think a lot of people are feeling this really deeply. I think this is why the Gundo is enjoying putting American flags up, because at least it's about serving the country, which is a bigger idea than just like a market, Like what are the ideas that are bigger than just a market, so to speak? I think serving the country is one, and all these things, and so I think that's part of what's happening.
It's so funny because the other half is going the other way, where it's like I spent $1 million of my VC's money traveling the world, or like the Cluey bullshit, like all of that is like speed running, like the like ends of that path, and then there's the other like kind of doing something for something bigger. So it's funny to watch those compete. I know which I'm drawn to. It feels like pretty lame to take it back down to earth and ask the final 3 questions, but I think you're going to have good ones, because the last time we met, you recommended the Tad friend profiles. So I'm going to ask you about them in the second question. So I know your recommendations are going to be good, but first, if people want to read one essay of yours, what should they read?
This is probably recency bias, but I think Political Expectations is something I wrote about sort of like, in the wake of like the election. And it's probably overly critical of the left, but it's critical of both sides. But I think all the technologies that we're dealing with today are quite politically critical. And I think that we have to have, going back to your point on like, some of the, like someone like Xi Jinping, who like maybe we view from a Western perspective of like lack of democracy, what have you, but the increase in state capacity for bringing China to the future, what are the trade-offs there? I think, we have such low political expectations in this country. And like, you see it with like California Rail, you see it with all these projects, that just go nowhere. And instead we get hung up on like identity politics, which will not save you, and all of these things. And even like, the fact that like the Dems are floating like Kamala for like another run. It's just like, what are we talking about right now? Like, what are we talking about? And I think, tech people tend to sort of view themselves as like a separate estate, but we're not. And I I think we have to like really reset our political expectations of the type of culture that we want. And so that essay is like kind of my attempt to do that.
Uber put out a new product that was like their shuttle or whatever, and like the same thing that happens every once in a while, which is like people are like, oh, buses. Uber invented the bus, and then somebody replied, they're like, Uber invented the bus, but not run by Democrats, and that's the difference.
Yeah, well, dude, I mean, I was waiting for the bus yesterday because I live in Clinton Hill. Right. So I either have to take the G to some train or I take the bus to some train. And the bus is like right outside my house. So I was waiting for the bus and it was like 5 minutes away. I was like, perfect. I'm going to open up, the founders pod and I'm gonna just like work or like dialectic, whatever. Right. And then it went from 5 minutes away to 22 minutes away. And I was like, how the hell could you even misjudge that? And I think, yeah, Uber invented the bus, but like the Uber app in terms of timing tends to be within a minute. And I'd rather my bus line be within a minute of understanding. And these are simple technologies that we just choose to not integrate or, take 5 years to integrate something as simple as like accuracy on like timing of like when something's going to arrive. And yeah, I mean, that's snarkiness also. Like, oh, Uber invented the bus. It's just like, do your buses run well right now? Tell me seriously, like, does your public transit run well? Yes or no? It's like without the ability to say like this is a problem, and this is where I think the Dems pretty much lost the election. Like if you can't say that something's a problem and then you put a celebrity on stage to twerk next to you, like you deserve to lose, period.
Speaking of dialectic, have you listened to the Anjan Kata episode yet?
Not yet. He's obviously a friend. Like I did the Daylight launch in New York for him. So like we're homies, and he's a wild boy, so I'm excited to listen this week.
He is a wild boy. I've really enjoyed all the dialectic conversations. I think it's my favorite new pod. Mm-hmm. That one is like maybe even another. I like tweet about it every time. This time I was like, I can't tweet about Jackson's podcast again. And then Anjan just like was so interesting that
mistaken. Yeah, exactly. Immediately tweet again.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so in the same vein of blowing other people up. What's one essay written by someone else that you think more people should read?
I would say Ideas Worth Building by Matt Hackett. I think this essay has been like super under the radar. I mean, Matt's just not like he doesn't like publicize his stuff too extremely. He's sort of a if you know sort of character in New York. But I thought that essay was very timely. I think that I just think a lot of where we are today is a sort of lack of discernment of what should actually accumulate effort. Like if any sort of effort is like this like object, right? And like we fill this object with people contributing to it. I think we very rarely give enough thought and care to like the object itself and whether that should be accumulating people within it. To me, like the worst part of any startup closing is not ever the founder. It's the people that were like convinced to work on this with the founder. And so I think Ideas Worth Building is actually like deeply important as we also think about the cost of producing any one thing continually going down, with AI.
I have not read that one. And can you also just for everybody else recommend the Tad Friend profiles?
The New Yorker wrote these series of profiles. One was, on Sam Altman. It was called Sam Altman's Manifest Destiny. The other was on Mark Andreessen, and I forget the title of that one. But then the other one was on Peter Thiel. And it's these 3 New Yorker profiles, all in like the 2010, like mid to late 2010s. Because I remember reading these at school, 2016. I'm trying to think about like what to do with my life. And I would just read these like non-stop. And then later, here's some funny updates. So then later we got Mark Zuckerberg's Lost Notebook. And this was about like all the notebook pages Mark would leave around Facebook in the early days. And it would be full details of like a product that he wanted to see. And you would just walk into the office and they would just be like on people's desks, right? So I actually talked about this with Saleo. And he was like, oh yeah, I have a couple pages from those notebooks, because Saleo was a very early design, maybe second designer at Facebook, something crazy like that. And it's super in depth too. It would be like Facebook needs to feel like and futuristic government where every time you click on something, it's bringing out new information about a person. Like, I think Mark actually gets written off as a slightly lucky person. I think Mark is deeply thoughtful, and like I think the Unity acquisition note is also a really great example of this. If you ever saw that like leaked note, incredible. So that's another one that kind of came out shortly after those profiles came out that I really loved. And then the new profile that came out this or last fall was the Alex Karp profile. I think that was that. I don't think that was a New Yorker though. I think that was the New York Times. That Alex Karp profile I thought was pretty badass. I think Alex Karp is a very interesting cat, and I think something that Founders Fund figured out much earlier than everyone else is that, quote, regulatory capture is good actually. And I don't think anyone, like, you know, Bill Gurley sort of like critiqued that last year or 2 years ago with like OpenAI, but I think actually a lot of Founders Fund early wins were deeply built around sort of the complexities of government and how if you can get a foothold there, you can kind of sustain competitive advantages over time because the process to break in is just so hard. You know, I think Anduril is another good example of this.
Which is another great profile. The Palmer Luckey American Vulcan by Jeremy
Oh,
Stern.
yeah,
was great. His profile
was a funny one.
I've become a big profile fan. Like even the old ones, like and this is appropriate, but Frank Sinatra Has a Cold by Guy Talese. Like just the long form profile is like the most beautiful thing to read, I think.
I just love character studies. Like even in film, like some of my favorite films are just like deep character study. Like my favorite film is There Will Be Blood, you know, and to me, like it's just such an incredible character study on that main character where the opposing force is also sort of like a charlatan preacher, you know. And I think that sort of, I just think American capitalism and American spirituality have always been together, particularly at the frontiers. And I think that movie shows it really, really well. I mean, in that one, individualism sort of like capitalism, individualism wins out aggressively. Maybe that's, you know, a future lesson of what might happen again. But yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. I haven't watched that movie in a decade now, so I'm gonna rewatch that.
That year was incredible for film.
What else was that year?
It's the two is, it's like There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men.
Yes,
those came out in the same year, you know, and
yes.
It's such like good. Yeah.
All right, last one. Thank you for going way over with me. This has been so much fun. If you could implant a one sentence takeaway about the piece in everybody listening's head, what's that one sentence?
You can't be afraid to be critical of our current gods, right? And by that, I mean, you know, I think like Sam Altman is very much like a current god. And I think people are afraid to be critical because I think Silicon Valley very much runs on relationships. And so being critical of people tend to have potential backfires. But I think it's sometimes that lack of criticality that gets us into very funny situations. And I think you can be critical of people without being mean to them or rude to them.
Yeah.
But simply saying like, hey, this is what I am seeing, and let me vocalize this in the most respectful way possible, you know, while being bold and radical about my own ideas. I think the perfect example right now is like the Johnny Ive interview with Patrick at Stripe Sessions. I thought it was genuinely bad. I thought that like he's talking about care and accessibility for the world, and his most recent projects are like Bentley and a $64,000 record player. Like it's just completely disjointed from his reality. But people are afraid to critique their hero, who they think is bearing the light of Steve Jobs, and that's just not true, you know. And so this lack of criticality exists all around us, and because it exists at some level, it's a form of worship, and everybody worships, whether you're conscious of it or not. And you have to choose what you're going to worship.
That's another good one sentence takeaway. I saw you say there about this piece. So if I could ask you for just like a one sentence takeaway about anything to implant in somebody's head, what do you have in mind?
Yeah, don't be afraid to come to God. God's already coming for you.
Amen. Reggie, thank you so much for doing this. This was a blast. I hope we have many more of these in the future, so keep writing.
Appreciate you, brother.